¿Hablas español?
Sprichst du Deutsch?
Kan du norsk?
If you've heard that sound from Babbel before, I bet you do. Babbel is the science-backed language learning app that actually works. With quick 10-minute lessons handcrafted by over 200 language experts, Babbel gets you on your way to speaking a new language in just a few weeks. With over 16 million subscriptions sold and a 20-day money-back guarantee, just start speaking another language with Babbel. Right now, up to 55% off your Babbel subscription at babbel.com/Spotify podcast. Spelled BABBEL.com/Spotify podcast. Rules and restrictions may apply.
Welcome to Mind Love, episode 230. Today's episode is all about the surprising science of how our brains learn from grief.
What's different about grieving is you have this attachment neurobiology. All these chemicals, dopamine and oxytocin, are really trying to motivate you to seek out this person. There are moments where we accept and know that it's true. We're not going to wake up next to this person again. And then other moments where it feels like, he's just on a trip. And so what comes to consciousness at different times can be different sources of that information that's under the surface.
Turn up your frequency with Mind Love. Bite-sized brain hacks for seekers, dreamers, and doers. It's time to give your mind a little love with your host, Melissa Monti.
If you're new to Mind Love, welcome. I'm so glad you're here. And here's your personal reminder to tap that little subscribe button. That way, you'll get reminders to give your mind a little love when new episodes release. And if you love the show, consider leaving a 5-star review. These help me entice all the amazing guests that you hear on the show. Most of us have experienced grief about something, whether from the death of a loved one or a pet, a terminal diagnosis for you or someone you love, or even a difficult breakup or divorce. Death is still the number one fear that humans have, so there can be a lot of emotions around it. For most people, there's a feeling of unknown, which can cause fear on top of the sadness. But even more painful can be trying to visualize your life without that person in it. Sometimes that means reimagining all of your future plans without that person, which adds a whole other layer to the unknown. The deepest grief I've ever experienced was the loss of my dad. He died of lymphoma when I was 19. The truth is, I never really thought he would die. My dad had always been the strongest and most energetic person that I knew, so even after his stage 4 diagnosis, and even after watching his body wither away for a year, I still thought he'd bounce back somehow. This was just the process of chemo. He'd get better. But he didn't. I saw him a week before he died, and he could barely talk anymore. I spent a whole day with him in the hospice center, helping him hold his can of peach nectar juice so he could drink from a straw. He'd get confused and start stringing unrelated words together in a sentence, like asking me if my classes were oily. I sat by his bedside while he slept and just held his hand until my stepdad picked me up to go to the airport. I remember glancing back at him when I was leaving, and he had this look in his eyes, like he was straining to tell me something through his tears. I think he knew that was the last time he'd see me. But I didn't. It was hard for me to reconcile this version of my dad with the man that I had always known, with his huge muscles and his graphic muscle tanks tucked into his shorts, slathering baby oil on himself whenever we'd exit his vehicle for some reason. I was at college when he died, and I never lived with him growing up, so it's not like there was this stark missing presence from my life all of a sudden. Understanding he had actually died was a really gradual process for me, a painful reminder one almost phone call at a time. And processing my grief around his loss was also very gradual. And I'm still processing new layers of it, especially with each big life milestone. I wish my dad could have walked me down the aisle. I wish I could see the relationship he'd have with my husband, and now my baby. And for a long time, I'd have judgment around how I was handling my own grief, or how other people expected me to handle it. I remember hearing, "You should be over this by now," from multiple people. But the truth is, grief can be complicated. It's not always a straight path of feeling badly to feeling better. Turns out it takes a long time for our brains to really internalize that someone is gone. So today we're learning about what happens to our brains on grief. And our guest is Mary Frances O'Connor. She's an associate professor of psychology at the University of Arizona, where she directs the Grief, Loss, and Social Stress Lab in investigating the effects of grief on the brain and the body. And she's also the author of The Grieving Brain, the surprising science of how we learn from love and loss. So 3 key things we will learn are what happens to the brain during grief, why some people adapt better than others when they lose someone, and how to move through healing when we're overwhelmed with grief. Before we go deep today, I want to give you a little gift, and I want to give it to you every single day. It's called the Morning Mind Love. I know how life can be. You're all fired up after an inspiring episode, and then a new day or a new challenge comes at you, and it's just hard to keep up that energy. Well, the Morning Mind Love is kind of like an oracle from your higher self to help you start each day with a positive focus. Plus, when you sign up, you get 2 free gifts, a 30-minute binaural meditation and 30 days of journaling prompts to help you remember who you truly are. And it's all completely free. So join over 9,000 people and go to mindlove.com to sign up or text the word morning to 33777. And now let's welcome Mary Frances O'Connor to the show.
Hi, it's so good to be here, Melissa.
So what inspired you to dedicate so much of your time towards the process or experience of grief?
Well, a lot has been written about what grief feels like, I think. And my interest was always more about the why and the how of grief. So how is it that the brain creates this experience for us? Or why is it able to encode these relationships that we have in the world? You know, something like love or grief actually turns into the gray matter of our brain. I find that fascinating. But beyond that, my mother died when I was 26. That's not as young as some people have the loss of a parent, but younger than others. I think it really meant that I was able to sit with people who were grieving, to do clinical interviews that maybe delved a little deeper than sometimes happens. And that really helped me to match up what people were saying with what I was seeing on the scientific side of neuroimaging. So that ability to really be there with people who were grieving, it just kept me really engaged. It felt like a meaningful reason to be doing this work.
Yeah, I lost my dad when I was 19. And it is such an interesting experience to lose somebody that you love, because I feel like I process it in different ways each year, especially as I evolve. And there's this part of me that wonders, like, what age is even the hardest to lose somebody? Or was it harder for me because I was 19 and more aware? Would have been harder when I was younger? Or would it be harder later on when I was even more aware, you know? And now I haven't lost somebody in a little while, and I was just reflecting on that when I was preparing for this interview. And I'm like, I wonder what that's going to be like, because on one hand, I'm so in tune with everything going on inside my body and my mind. Will that make it more intense because I notice all the nuances? But I also have this greater sense of acceptance over things, or an understanding of how to process things. So in a way, this sounds super weird, but I'm almost not excited, but looking forward to how I will grow through that experience now versus before, when everything was about numbing. But one of the things I remember right after it happened, when I wasn't necessarily numbing, is that there were a number of times where I actually picked up the phone to call my father. And I did, and it went to his voicemail. Our family kept his phone on for a little bit. Yeah. And then I even remember that time that I called his phone and it finally was disconnected, and it was like a whole new grieving process. Yes. And I know that's one of the things that you explore in your book. So my question is, why is it so difficult to understand that a person has died and is actually gone forever?
This seems so bizarre. People will say, I'm really not crazy. I know that he has died, but it just feels like he's going to come back, like he's going to walk through the door again. Or habits, as you describe, where we just engage as though they are really there. I think there are reasons if we think about it from the perspective of the brain, but a surprising thing to most people is that the brain can hold two different streams of information at the same time. And like in grieving, sometimes those streams of information actually conflict. So on the one hand, we have a memory, say being there at the bedside, caring for your dad, or as I did for my dad, and you've been at the funeral. So you have this part of your brain that has the information that he's gone. But when we form a bond with someone, when we fall in love with our spouse or our child, or we are loved by our parent, that bond gets encoded in the brain, and it comes along with it a very particular belief, that belief that you will always be there for me and I will always be there for you. And we call that the attachment belief. And what's important is you don't have to be in someone's presence to believe that they exist, right? We couldn't kiss our spouse and send them off to work every day if we didn't deeply believe that they would be back, even though we aren't seeing them through the hours of the day. So this works great for keeping us attached, keeping those tethers when we're out in the world, so that we come back and spend time together. Where that solution doesn't work very well is after the death of a loved one. Now, this is a really uncommon event, thankfully. But when that happens, your brain is still trying to use the same solution. So they're not here. So just call them, go get them, right? Or make enough noise so they come and rescue you. And it's a conflicting piece of information. So on the one hand, the attachment neurobiology tells you this is an everlasting relationship. They'll always be there. And then the memories, on the other hand, tell you that can't be true because I know that they died. I think this is why it takes so long to learn that they're really gone, because you have these mutually exclusive beliefs at the same time.
Yeah, and I feel myself, even now, it's been so long. I mean, how old am I now? I'm 37. I lost him when I was 19. It's been like 19. Whoa. Wow. Yeah. I am just now coming to terms with the fact that he has been gone as long as I knew him. Yeah. Oh my gosh, I can get all choked up. But isn't that funny how now this new understanding, all of a sudden I'm like, I wasn't expecting to cry today. Yeah. But it brings up another layer and another layer. And I remember learning the stages of grief when I was young, and it's like denial, anger, bargaining, depression, acceptance. Whoever taught it to me also taught me about hope at the end. They said they added that on there, DABDA. And so I remember having those same feelings. I actually can relate to them even more through a friend in high school who committed suicide. This was my first experience with real loss. And I was mad at first. And actually what got me over that anger was I ended up volunteering for the suicide and crisis hotline, because at first I was like, how could you do this? It was a friend that actually, also in high school, his girlfriend broke up with him. His girlfriend was my best friend at the time. And I remember thinking it was selfish. Like it felt like it was done to her, because before he did that, there was a lot of what seemed to be emotional manipulation with her, like threatening that he was going to do it. Nobody thought he was. And it was like, what are you doing? And so then those feelings lingered into even after his death, like, oh my gosh, the ultimate form of manipulation. And it seems terrible to think about it that way now. No. But I remember finally understanding through the process of volunteering that when the brain goes into crisis mode, there is no solution at the other end. So this is the only way they can feel they can get through it. But regardless of that specific situation, I think I even had anger with my dad when he died. Looking back at, like, why didn't you leave me a longer letter? Why were you this way at this time? And so it's confusing when you're having to deal with that. You're dealing with loss. You're dealing with these emotions that you don't know how to resolve, because maybe there's no reason to be angry, or you're making up reasons to be angry and you can't talk to them about it, so you can't get them to say sorry. So why does grief cause so many different emotions beyond just sadness?
It's such an intense experience, and you described so many losses really well right then. And, Dr. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross was an amazing woman. She was a psychiatrist when there were not a lot of women in psychiatry. And she came out with that 5 stages of grief in 1969. And so you think about, where science was in 1969. We've actually come a long way since then. So she was doing what all good scientists do in the beginning. She was describing what she was seeing, right? So she was having these conversations with people and writing down the emotions they were having, just like you described, anger and depression and acceptance and so forth. The problem is it came to be thought of as a prescription and not just a description, right? So the idea that you would go through these stages in a particular order, and then when you got to the end, you wouldn't have those feelings anymore. Well, more modern research with much larger samples and looking at the same person over many time points instead of in a single conversation, we've come to recognize that it doesn't really work like that, right? That over time, in general, we see an increase in acceptance, but there's some acceptance even often right at the beginning. And over time, you see a decrease in yearning for the person. And so what that means is it's not a linear process. For example, we know from looking at data that people's feelings of grief are increased around the holidays or at the anniversary of someone's death. So just because you have more grief in that moment doesn't mean there's anything wrong with your grieving. In fact, I like to make a distinction between those two words. Grief as that sort of momentary awareness, just like you had right now when you said, it's been as long that I've been without him as I had him. In that moment, you experience grief, right? But just because you have grief in that moment doesn't mean there's anything wrong with your grieving. It doesn't mean that you haven't changed in your understanding of this experience over time in a way that you have found a way to integrate it into your life, to carry his absence with you in a meaningful way. So I think what gets confusing for people is they think, well, if I have grief right now, then I've done something wrong. And they haven't done anything wrong, right? Some people never experience anger. And that's okay. But they sometimes worry like, oh, someday I'll feel anger, or I haven't finished grieving because I never felt anger. It just doesn't work that way. There's such a range of experiences.
This episode is brought to you by Etsy.
Oh.
Hear that?
Okay. Thank you.
Etsy knows these aren't the sounds of holiday gifting. Well, not the ones you're hoping for. You want squeals of delight. Happy tears.
How did you?
And spontaneously written songs of joy.
I am so happy. Oh yeah, oh yeah, oh yeah.
Okay, the song needs a bit of work, but anyway, to get those reactions, make sure everyone on your list feels heard with handmade, handpicked, and designed gifts from small shops on Etsy. Gifts like personalized jewelry, custom artwork, cozy style items, vintage pieces, and home decor to celebrate all of your favorite people and their specific kind of special. For original gifts that say, I get you, Etsy has it.
In the chapter of your book that was talking about really why it takes so long to understand that our loved one is gone forever, one of the things that you had mentioned was that multiple forms of knowledge our brain holds simultaneously. And it's funny because I'm the kind of person who reads like 3 books at once. And then I skip to this other book and I start reading that one, Waking Up with Sam Harris. And he was talking about consciousness and the nature of consciousness. And I'm not even done with the chapter, so I don't even know where it's going, but he starts to talk about how there's like this binocular experiment where they put binoculars on, and if they show one image, like a house on one your right eye, and then like tree on your left eye, you'd almost think that it would like combine the images, but instead your brain actually flips back and forth between these 2 images rapidly. And so I'm wondering, does that at all related to this idea of like flipping back and forth between the understanding that your loved one's here versus your loved one not being here, and that's why it takes so long to fully like integrate reality?
The brain is a complex place, really, that we're just starting to understand. But I think it is related in the sense that under the surface of conscious awareness, there's all sorts of processes going on, right? Like I'm sitting up straight and I'm breathing and I can feel my chair and all those things that aren't a part of my conscious awareness as I'm having this conversation with you, but are going on in the background, right? All that information is being collected. So just like one eye, that image comes into consciousness versus then the other eye, that image comes into consciousness. I think it is similar where there are moments where we accept and know that it's true. We're not going to wake up next to this person again. And then other moments where it feels like, he's just on a trip. And so what comes to consciousness at different times can be different sources of that information that's under the surface. I think it's unique with grieving because we're so motivated to spend time with our loved ones, to find them again. And so, I use the example when I teach a class in a particular classroom and the semester ends, and then I go back into the classroom at the beginning of the next semester, I don't expect any of those same students to show up again and sit in those chairs, right? It's not a hard thing to learn that there were people in one place and now they're not there anymore. What's different about grieving is you have this attachment neurobiology. All these chemicals, dopamine and oxytocin, are really trying to motivate you to seek out this person, even though we know that's not possible. So I think it's different when you have this bond and you lose the person. It's not just a matter of updating, the name of the person in the chair in front of you. It's really while being motivated, really yearning for the person to be back.
I don't think I would have understood that concept as much just a year and a half ago. I have a 13-month-old now. And so a lot of understanding even how to be a good parent, which parenting style I want to adopt, was understanding attachment theory, and like the fact that my baby needs me all the time. And for me, it feels too early to be like, no, you need to develop autonomy right now because they don't have that capability. It's totally natural for them to cry for mama. So I kept him so close to me. I still do.
It's natural.
Yeah. And it just makes me, it makes that understanding of grief a little bit differently, like that seeking out. It almost breaks my heart thinking about it. Apparently, I'm a little emotional today. But just thinking about that, me calling him back when I was 19, I remember a specific incident where I was sitting by a pool, and I usually just would call my dad when I would lay out with the pool, and it was like this whole breakdown moment of realizing again, I think I cried more that day than I did the first day I found out he was gone because it was hard to grasp that reality.
Yes.
And so we know that the brain is constantly trying to seek out that loved one. But is there anything else that is happening in the brain during grief that makes it unique?
Well, there's so much going on in the brain at the same time. One of the things that happens is we have all these intrusive thoughts, especially early on after we lose someone. And some of it has to do with the what ifs, right? This is somewhat what you were describing with your friend in high school who died by suicide. All those what ifs. I sometimes call them the would've, could've, should've, right? You should have reached out. I could have called you. If only, the doctor had known and could have ordered another test, right? The thing is, there are an infinite number of those, right? And in our mind, we are writing all these virtual realities, but the end of every one of them is, and then my loved one lived, right? And the tragic thing is, of course, they didn't live. And so if we spend a lot of time in those thoughts, we're actually avoiding the feeling, the experience of what life is like now in their absence, right? So if we're spending a lot of time in those thoughts, we're actually not in the present moment. That is very painful. So it's understandable that people don't want to spend a lot of time there when they're really suffering with grief. But that's also the only place that all the positive emotions happen. So that's where our living loved ones are that can comfort us. And that's where silly things happen, like, the puppy falling over itself. And right, all of those positive things are happening in the present moment. And if we're not in it with both the bitter and the sweet, then it's very hard for us to learn what life is like and how we might restore a meaningful life in the absence of this person.
I can totally relate to that. And two what ifs came to mind. I had visited my dad the week before he died, and it was so hard. Like, it was just really, really hard. I think this was the time that I really realized that he wasn't just going to come back or get better. He died of lymphoma, and I was in this hospice care center with him. And my dad was just like this strong guy. Like, he brought these like push-up handles everywhere. Was always slathering himself in baby oil. Like, everyone called him Buff Bob. Like, he was just a strong, vibrant person. And so to watch him withering away was weird. And it was also my first year in college. So I would come back and see how different he was all of a sudden. But I think I never fully grasped that he was actually going to die until he did. And my aunt called me and she said, it's not looking too good. You should come back. And I was like, I can't do it this week. I'll do it next week. And he died that week. And I regretted that so much. He died alone in his room. And then, of course, I what-ifed our whole relationship. Like, what if I had been a better daughter? And I think a lot of my healing and my self-growth has allowed me to look at that in a different way. Like, I saw the futility in thinking that way and just the extra pain I was causing myself. So I really developed a sense of acceptance. But I have to say, until I had a baby and the amount of what ifs that I'm like, what would their relationship have been like? What if my dad could see my baby? What if he could see my life now? Yeah. Like, now that I'm really proud of my life. And it all kind of came back, and it makes me realize, you got to continue to do that work, because those thoughts may always come back up. And like I said, like, I'm a different person now than when I lost him. And I understand the power of feeling those emotions, because in the beginning, my whole process of dealing with it was just to numb. I was partying all the time. I couldn't really be alone. And so I had to deal with that grief that I just shoved to the side years and years later. I had to sit with it and mourn the loss of my dad because I think those feelings are always going to be there until you deal with them. And so now you can actually hear my voice a little hoarse. I was dealing with something the other day and I was just like, I need to get these emotions moved through me. So I got in my car. I live in the mountains and I drove somewhere where no one was around and I just screamed and I was like, I'm a podcast host. Maybe I need a different grief tactic here. But I'm curious though. I know for me now, I have all of this, like, I've trained myself in certain ways. I have this knowledge on how to deal with hard things. But some people seem to naturally adapt better than other people when they lose a loved one. What are the differences that you've seen with the way people handle things and how it causes some people to spiral like I did in my 20s and some people to just automatically grow or even just accept it sooner?
There's so much variation. And also, I think it's helpful to remember that what we see on the outside isn't the expressions that we see of grief, or not expressions of grief, don't always match up with the experience of grief that people are having on the inside. So sometimes people look so cool and collected and put together, and you think, how is that possible? But they're actually also getting in the car and going out and screaming at other times, right, when we're not seeing them. In any case, we do know there is variation in the way that people adapt. And through scientific research that looks at people over many time points in that first couple of years, we know actually that the majority of us are resilient. That doesn't mean that there's not pain and suffering, but it does mean we find a way to continue to have everyday life, even though it's different, even though, we have these waves that overcome us. We are still able, for the most part, to move forward, even if our shoes don't match while we're doing that, So there's a much smaller proportion of people who really struggle to adapt. And then there is this group who have what we call post-traumatic growth. And this is a group of people who come to understand what happened and interpret what happened in a way that they feel makes their life now better. So this could be, everything from I find my life is meaningful in a different way because I feel like I'm living for two people now. Or I had no idea that people would be so good to me, right? That people just came out of the woodwork that I would never have guessed would be supportive. And now they're some of my closest friends because we faced this together, right? So there's lots of different flavors of post-traumatic growth, and they really have to come from the inside. These do not come from advice. These are insight, right, that comes from the inside. But what I think is so interesting is that when you think about it, losing a loved one is just an incredible stress, and it changes everything for us. We find that if people have enough support to have some time to process that, to come to understand what their life is like now and what they might do that they think of as feeling meaningful, that they tend to have a better time adapting than if they don't have social support or they are under-resourced in other ways. So we sometimes forget that bereavement is a health disparity, right? If we know there are different rates of mortality in our different communities, then of course that means there's different rates of bereavement as well. And so if you're already in a situation where you have food insecurity, or you're dealing with, racism, or you're having trouble learning in school, then those are going to make it much harder to add something on top of that you have to deal with.
That might have been one of the difficulties, was that I was on my own for the first time also.
Yes.
So it was weird because I was not used to seeing my dad every day. And so it was kind of easy to ignore.
Yes.
Sometimes, until it wasn't. I think I was also at an age where I definitely used it as an excuse, actually. It was like I had the excuse and I had all the feelings. But then I remember getting out of different assignments or doing things late. And if I really look at it, I've gone through so many ideas or ways of looking at that period of time. And I remember for a long time, I felt really guilty. Like, how could I lose something or use something like that to almost my benefit? But now, as an older person, I understand that I was actually just kind of being honest. Like, I started spiraling because I was grieving. I started dropping the ball on a lot of things because I was grieving. And so I've had to find that compassion for myself. But I think that even added more layers, because then I was judging my actions, and I was, all of a sudden had a different identity where I was used to getting straight A's with everything. And then now I'm not that person. I'm like slacking or whatever. And I know you talk about something called complicated grief. What makes grief more complicated?
So complicated grief is a little bit older term that we use now. We call it prolonged grief disorder now, usually, but it's the same. We're looking at the same phenomena. And this is really where people's natural grief response and their grieving changes over time have gotten derailed somehow. And that could be for lots of different reasons, but they often get derailed and we see specific symptoms of that, like feeling like you're just going through the motions, like you're doing things in your day, but nothing is meaningful, or feeling really angry with the people around you who have not experienced loss, or being really confused about what your role is in life now. Now, almost all of us have these experiences early on, and many of them have them off and on forever, right? But for people who have prolonged grief disorder, it's such an interference. They are so derailed that they can't do the things that they would like to in life. And the most important part for me about having this group of experiences to look at that are derailing is that we know now there are psychotherapies that can specifically target people who have been struggling for a really long time. We don't even think about this criteria until a year after a person has died. And it can be 10 years after a person has died when suddenly they think, maybe I could learn some more skills, or I could come up with a different way to think about this if I was talking to a therapist who knows a lot about it. And so that's really an opportunity to see that targeted therapy can help move people from feeling really stuck and like nothing will ever get better into a place not where they don't have grief, because we're all going to have grief, right? Grief is just the natural response, but where they feel like I am on a trajectory of understanding how it fits into my life. I can go into those waves of grief and come out of them again. So that's what we generally think about.
I have learned that so many of the times that I was just, I guess I view the way I've thought about things differently, because I've gone through just a lot of hard times, come out of them eventually, but I also spent a period of time where I was stuck in them. I was a victim of my circumstances. And some of the things in real life I was a victim of, but I viewed myself that way. And I, at some point, realized that wasn't helpful. Like, I'm the only person that's going to take responsibility for my life. But it took me a while. And what I understand now, at least what gets me through the hard moments now, is that my thoughts are also habits. And so if I allow myself to ruminate too much in a certain direction, then I'm just going to breed more of the thoughts in that same energy, and it's going to be harder and harder to get out of it. And so I have to consciously choose to think of something a different way, even if it feels like bullshit at first, where I'm like, God, I'm looking at the bright side of this totally crappy situation. And that's not to say that I'm trying to move through it with like toxic positivity or whatever they call it these days. I understand the hurt and pain in it. And I know that it's so important to feel those feelings, like I said before, otherwise they're gonna come back for you to deal with. But at the same time, thinking of something in a specific way that you cannot change over and over again also isn't going to help you. And so is that when grief turns into depression? Or is there not really a one-size-fits-all to be able to explain that? How do you know when you're sitting in your grief too long versus when you should take conscious steps or work with your thoughts to move out of it?
I think it's helpful to know that research has really demonstrated that grief and depression are two different things. So I also had depression after my mom died, and I didn't have prolonged grief disorder, right? So depression is often a really global thing. Let's put it this way. In grief, the primary sort of hallmark thing is yearning for this person to be back, just wanting things to be the way they were before. Yearning is not actually a symptom of depression, right? Depression is this global thing that's kind of almost contagious between different aspects of your life. So you may be really sad or feel guilty about something about this person who's died that you loved, but you probably also are really worried about, are you a good enough friend? And ruminating about, what is the world going to be like in 20 years? And right, like there's, and feeling that you need to ask forgiveness for something you did in high school, right? Depression is this really global, affects all different kinds of aspects of your life. And it can come along after you've had the death of someone. It can be that you had depression before someone died and you felt better eventually, and now it's kind of back again, right? So I think I have to take a sort of zoomed out look when I think, am I spending too much time, quote, in my grief? I think it really depends for each individual person. When my dad was a widower, he adopted several other widowers in town, men who had experienced the death of their wives. And he talked to me at one point about a dear friend who had recently lost his wife. And he said, he keeps wanting to show me photo albums of them together, trips they've taken and stuff. And he says, I'm a little worried, like he keeps doing this over and over. And I'm not sure whether to encourage him or not. And I said, well, Dad, it sounds to me like you two also, you go to Kiwanis lunches together and you volunteer at the church together and sometimes you cook dinner together. So there's many aspects to his life, and this is just one of them that he needs to express. And he said a long time later that he would never have sort of continued to sit with him while he did that if I hadn't said this, almost giving him permission. And he said it just sort of naturally happened that eventually he stopped doing it as often. And then at some point, it was very infrequent. So I think there is sort of a natural process that we go through, and it's more about, is your total life making sense? Are there times that you can focus on the loss and then other times when you're focused on everyday life?
I remember after my dad passed, especially at that age, 19 at San Diego State University, I would get sad about my dad and people were like, let's take a shot or let's go to this party. Like, let's forget about it. And I remember being very aware at a certain point of the very few people that would ask me questions about him. People were afraid to open that up, like it was going to open a wound, which on one hand, yeah, I did usually get emotional when I was able to talk about him, but it was like I needed that. Like I wanted to keep him alive. And my husband knows that now. If I start talking about my dad, he just indulges me, lets me talk about him. We talk about him with my baby because I want him to know that what he was like, and so I can see wanting to have his energy or his spirit live on through the memories, especially being an only child with him. I didn't have siblings to talk about that with, or my parents divorced when I was so young. I didn't even have my mom to talk about that with. And so it was like it felt like I was responsible. It was on my shoulders to keep his memory alive. And I feel like he so deserved that. And there's certain things that I still think about that I'm like, I wonder how I would have, what my relationship would have been with my dad now, my understanding of him at this age versus at that age. But one thing that I've read about is that some cultures actually have like a specific period of time that people are meant to grieve. And I think there might be a lot of power in that, like creating a container to really just let yourself let go without the judgment. Because I think anytime I used to get super sad, there would be at least one level of judgment for myself. Like, should it last this long? Should I be crying this hard? Like, why am I, like whatever it is. And so I feel like that could be a healthy thing to do, to be like, these first 2 weeks, I'm not leaving my house. I'm just crying, and then it kind of gives you a point to be like, okay, well, now is the point that I gotta like put pants on and go outside.
Yeah.
And so is there a healthy way to deal with grief? Well, if we find ourselves overwhelmed with grief, what should or could we do to move ourselves through that process in a way that, maybe lessens the chance of us getting stuck in it or just adding to our own pain?
It used to be that people thought, for example, that avoidance was just the worst thing you could do, right? I think it's important to have a really big toolkit of coping strategies, So the morning after my mom died, was in my little tiny hometown, and she had died in the night. And I went to this restaurant in the morning to get breakfast with my best friend. And the owner of the restaurant came up and she said, honey, I'm so sorry to hear, she said, what do you want? You can have anything. And I said, I want a beer. And she said, you got it. Because in that moment, that was sort of the best matchup of what I could handle with the coping strategy that I had. And so I think the important thing is to use a bunch of different skills. If I continued to drink a beer every morning for breakfast for the next year, this would probably be a problem, right? So it's really about having a bunch of strategies. So it's okay on the one hand to be like, you know what, I am going to sit down and go through this photo album, and it does mean I'm probably going to cry all afternoon. And then another time to be like, you know what? I just don't want to think about this right now. It's not that I'm avoiding it per se, but I'm going to go for a walk because I just need to get into a different headspace. Even if I might still feel sad, I just need to be in a different environment, right? Or I feel like I need to go to the graveside, or I feel like I need to pray, or I feel like I need to reach out and call a friend, or I feel like I need to put on this ridiculous movie and just laugh about it and not think about anything. I think the key is to have really a lot of different strategies and not keep reaching for the same one.
That is how I live my life. It took me a long time to figure that out, but I'm always telling my listeners about having your toolbox, because what works for me one day might not work for me the next. And I went through a very long period of time where, again, there was an inner judgment for this, because I'm like, is there just nothing that will work for me long term? Am I just not meant for success or to feel better or to feel happy or whatever it is? And then now I'm like, okay, I've got a power list of things that make me feel good. And some days the long walk is going to sound great, and some days it's going to sound terrible. Some days it's going to be yoga. Some days it's going to be crying. So I reach for different things, but that does take a kind of self-awareness to be able to ask myself, well, what do you need in this moment? And it's funny that you talked about the thinking before that avoidance was the worst thing in the world. One thing I recently learned that surprised me in interviewing this author, Ethan Kross, who wrote a book called Chatter. And he talked about how sharing our emotions impacts how we feel over time. And one example that was used was that the people who shared their thoughts and feelings about 9/11 right after it happened didn't feel better. In fact, on the whole, they fared worse than the people in the study who didn't open up at all how they felt. And so it's so interesting that I think I learned, get it out, share it with people. But at the same time, you're also adding more power sometimes to those negative emotions. And I think there's a balance for that. It's not to say you shouldn't talk about it at all, but some people do get caught in that habit of just constantly talking about this moment. And so they stay in that moment and they never really move out of it.
Yes, I think that's so well put, being able to do both. And I think this can help us to understand people around us who maybe react really differently. I remember my sister saying, gosh, I feel like I'm not really grieving for our mom. And I said, but Caroline, you're taking care of the house. You've taken care of her clothes. You're doing all these things. I said, I think that's the way you're expressing it. You don't have to sit in a puddle and cry in order to do things that are meaningful, that continue that relationship with her, or understand its transformation in your life now. I think knowing that can let us be a little more accepting of the people around us and how they handle their grief.
Yeah, I think the older I get, the more I realize that I may never understand other people, but I also may never fully understand myself, so that's okay. Like, my whole life is an unfolding of peeling back another layer to my own onion. And so to even pass any judgment on anybody else with what they're going through is just foolish, because you can never know, or you don't know if their way's better or worse. We just can't really ever fully be in somebody else's shoes. But I'm wondering, what can cognitive psychology contribute to our understanding of grieving as a form of learning?
This has taken me a long time to come to. I've been in this doing grief research for over 20 years now. And I came to understand really that many of the different things I was looking at could be encapsulated in thinking of grieving as a form of learning. And that's everything from having to relearn those habits, right? So you have some pattern. I go and I lay out in the sun and then I call my dad, right? And you have to relearn, oh, wait, that habit doesn't work now, or I never buy mushrooms at the store because my child doesn't like mushrooms, and so I'm not going to cook with them. Oh, but my child isn't here, and that's not a relevant piece of information in the grocery store right now. So on the one level, there's just even relearning the habits. But on another level, I think it is also learning, what does it mean that I have come in touch with mortality in this way? How does that change what I want to do with my life? How does that change what I want to do today? And so coming to understand who we are, and you've described that so beautifully, that that can change over time. Your understanding of your relationship to yourself is going to change. So, of course, your understanding of your relationship to your loved one is going to change even after they've died, right? So I think on lots of levels, grieving, that change over time of grieving can be thought of as learning. It makes it more familiar. We all know learning can be frustrating and take a long time.
I think it makes it easier for somebody like me, at least, to deal with, when I feel like there's a reason for things, or there's not just light at the end of the tunnel, but growth at the end of this experience. And so thank you so much for everything that you've added to just the topic of grief in general. This is a book I wish I had 19 years ago. So for listeners that are really resonating and want to learn more, where's the best place they can connect with you or find your book?
The book is available anywhere that books are sold, and it's also available as an ebook, an audiobook. And if they want to learn more about me or my research, I'm at maryfrancesoconnor.com.
All the links from this episode are at mindlove.com/230. Your challenge for this week is to have some compassion with whatever you're going through. I know this isn't a specific teaching that we learned from this episode, but it's something that I continuously remind myself as I go through anything. And so it's a great practice to help become your default, to do over and over and over again until it does become your default. And the whole practice is just to release any judgment over what you're going through, how long it's taking, what you're feeling, and replace it with a loving compassion. I've listened to a lot of audio lectures this week from Grieving Brain while I'm reading his physical book, The Divine Matrix. And a lot of the teachings come back to this state of feeling that we hold within our bodies that is what actually creates change around us. It's an ancient practice that was lost to many of us, especially in the West, 1700 years ago. I'm sure you've heard me talk about how parts of our history were stolen from us based on those in power. Doesn't seem that different from what still goes on. But the point is that the ancients knew this. It's the basis of the power of prayer. It's not just supposed to be us asking for something that we want, although that's a path as well. But the technology, the inner technology of what actually occurs is that feeling that you hold within yourself that can cause even spontaneous healing. And so the ancients would practice this feeling of loving gratitude. In the ancient days of the Essenes, which are a people whom a lot of our spiritual traditions, almost all of them, have adopted some form of their teaching, including even the beliefs of the Native Americans. And even they, thousands of years ago, recognized how difficult it is to love ourselves. And so the way around this is to actually just hold love for other people. And so when I feel grief, one of the practices that I do is I just touch my heart area. That touch can help you to focus on that general area of your body. And in our hearts, we actually have an electromagnetic field that the technology that we have today can study that it goes 5 to 8 feet out from our hearts. And when we focus our attention on that, it can actually increase that electromagnetic field. But just by holding on to our hearts and thinking of somebody that we love, maybe thinking of a time with our loved one that we're missing and visualizing it in our minds to where we can feel the feelings in our body. Just by doing that, we're also loving ourselves and helping ourselves to heal. So this is a practice that I do when I'm feeling low, when I'm feeling grief. And like I said, science has actually shown, if you look into research done by the HeartMath Institute, it can actually cause spontaneous healing within our body. And so possibly even within our minds. So if this episode was helpful for you, take a screenshot and share it on social media and tag Mind Love Melissa and Mind Love Podcast. If you'd like to support Mind Love, the best way to do so is by joining Mind Love Premium at mindlove.com/premium. You get the whole backlog of exclusive episodes, sometimes early release and ad-free episodes, plus some other bonuses. And a free way to support the show is by leaving a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts or on Spotify. So thanks for giving your mind a little love today, and I'll see you next week.
Thanks for tuning into Your Higher Frequency with Mind Love. Head to mindlove.com for a free gift to keep your vibes up until next week.